Shana Tova. I'd like to share two things with you up front. Number one, I miss shul. Specifically, I miss communal singing. I miss catching up with friends over kiddush. I miss the community coming together for happy and sad occasions. I miss handshakes and hugs. In short, I miss being with the Jewish community in synagogue services. Number two, there are a number of things that I have enjoyed about online services over the last 6 months. We have a lot to learn from this experience that I hope we can replicate once we return to in-person services. As we contemplate the role of synagogue in Jewish life, it's important to note that the synagogue has historically filled three functions. Number one, it's a Beit Tfilah, a house of prayer. Number two, it's a Beit Midrash, a house of study. And number three, it's a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering. Let's take a closer look at each of those. Beit Tfilah, house of prayer. It may seem obvious that a synagogue is a house of prayer, since that's what we typically go to synagogue to do. However, prayer is also a very personal activity that one can do anywhere. In today's Haftarah, or prophetic reading, Hannah is facing the depths of despair over her infertility. Vehi marat nefesh vatitpalel el Adonai uvacho tivke. In her wretchedness, she prayed to Adonai, weeping all the while. The editors of Machzor Lev Shalem, the new high holiday Machzor of the conservative movement, comment on this verse that the pain Hannah feels over her infertility is emblematic of the way in which life's most difficult and painful challenges may also be moments of deepening one's relationship with God. Indeed, the rabbis of the Talmud look to Hannah's prayer as a model for how Jews should concentrate and say the words of the Amidah, or Shmona Esrei prayer. A beautiful book was published recently, edited by Rabbi Menachem Creditor and Sarah Tuttle Singer, in which they collect essays by Jews from around the world, reflecting on the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic in all facets of life, with much focus on Jewish life since last March of 2020. One of the essayists, Jacqueline Novit, writes that she was scheduled to lead the Hallel prayer on Passover at her New York City synagogue. Hallel is a prayer expressing joy and thanksgiving. The author writes, in the midst of her sadness, that she could not go to synagogue, and she was tempted not to say Hallel at all while homebound. However, when the writer reflected on the many helpers in her community, from health workers to grocery store clerks, she discovered many reasons for gratitude. And she said Hallel with more fervor than ever. Rather than do away with prayer when she could not attend synagogue, Jacqueline Novit reimagines the purpose of prayer in the first place. During the time that we are still physically apart, let us reflect on the role prayer plays in our lives to help us give voice to our deepest sentiments, including gratitude, as well as wishes, regrets, and fears. In many online services that I've attended, I've noticed special attention given to frontline workers in prayers for their well-being. In our current online prayer, and when we return to synagogue, I hope that we will resolve not to recite words out of the book by rote, without thought or feeling. Rather, let us approach tefillah with the passion and sincerity of Hannah in our Haftorah today. The synagogue as a Beit Midrash, house of study. When the history is written of how the Jewish community responded to COVID-19, I think there will be much focus on the creativity of rabbis and lay people alike in studying the ancient texts of our tradition and applying the wisdom of our texts to the current challenges. COVID affected Orthodox, conservative, Reform, everyone. An Orthodox rabbi recently published a 600-page book addressing the myriad of halachic or Jewish legal issues raised by COVID. At the heart of Jewish tradition is the law of pikuach nefesh, preservation of life, even if it means violating Sabbath restrictions. We have often been taught that in theory, but it was fascinating to experience observant Jews of all stripes adapting Jewish practice as a result. Within our own conservative movement, the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards has done heroic work in responding to the needs of our communities in answering questions about online worship, Shabbat observance, kosher for Passover food, funeral rituals, Shiva observance, medical ethics, just to name a few. Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist and Holocaust survivor, said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." In response to the crisis of the pandemic, in a very short window of space, many of my rabbinic colleagues mustered incredible creativity in service to the Jewish people. In addition, rabbis of synagogues have been working in overdrive over the last 6 months, teaching more Torah classes than ever before, as congregants have been thirsty for knowledge and engagement with our sacred wisdom. When we return to synagogue, my hope is that clergy and laity will continue to study Torah with creativity, both in the way Torah is studied, such as through online classes, as well as applying the Torah to our everyday lives. Our Torah has sustained us through this crisis. Torah is alive and well. It is up to us to keep it that way when we return to shul in person. Finally, the synagogue is a Beit Knesset, a house of communal gathering. No matter how much time we spend on Zoom, it's not the same thing as being physically present with the people we care about. Dr. Ron Wolfson has been writing and teaching for years about the future of the American synagogue as a wellspring of Jewish life. He offers guidance on how to strengthen synagogue communities and expand the tent of inclusion so that everyone feels welcome. At the cornerstone to building relationships is knowing people's names. Wolfson advocates people in synagogue use name tags so that everyone feels included. It occurred to me over the last few months, attending numerous meetings over Zoom, including many services, that everyone's name is printed on the screen. This may seem small, but I really do feel a deeper sense of connection to someone once I know his or her name. The Israeli poet Zelda, drawing on the biblical book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, wrote a famous poem titled L'chol ish yesh shem. Every person has a name. In a Zoom gathering, everyone has a name. Everyone is accounted for. When we go back to synagogue, how will we translate the Zoom experience to make sure that no one is forgotten. Our future depends on our ability to strengthen inclusion. The synagogue that we know and love is a Beit Tfilah, a house of prayer to nourish our spirit. It is a Beit Midrash, a house of study to nourish our mind. And it's a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering to nourish the living, breathing body of our community. I miss synagogue. And I like what we've created online in the midst of this crisis of our generation. Like Hannah, we have reason to cry and wail in anguish over the pain that our society is experiencing now. But like Hannah, we must find the inner strength and courage to look forward and rebuild Jewish communal life even better than it was before. Let us fulfill the words of the psalmist. Hazorim b'dim'ah, b'rina yiktsoru. We plant seeds now with tears in our eyes over what we have lost. However, let us reap a future harvest with great joy over what we will rebuild. Amen.